And joining us now on Market Talk, pleased to have on Josh Linville with StoneX. Josh, how are you today?
I'm doing great. A little wet down here in Kansas City, but otherwise good. How about yourself?
Hey, I am good, Josh. And you talk about it being a little wet, giving us a little pause on harvest, and maybe a good thing. Let guys regroup just a little bit. They've been running pretty hard the last couple of weeks, from what we've been hearing across the country, for sure.
Yeah, I know we always hate to see any sort of a break in the harvest. Once you start, you want to get it done, but there's something to
Mhm.
be said about get a little bit of rest, get your equipment back up and running because we all know we've been patching some stuff together. So a couple days off isn't the worst thing in the world.
No, it is not for sure. Well, Josh, we got a lot to talk about on the fertilizer side here today. And, I think a lot of producers, a lot of folks in agriculture, pretty concerned right now just with the rising costs of fertilizer, availability, supply chain issues. There's no shortage of angles we could attack this topic at here today. But I think just to start, what are your thoughts on the current state of this fertilizer market and just how we've seen prices skyrocket here in recent weeks?
Yeah, and it's been recent weeks, we get recent months. I mean, obviously the last year. It's I don't want to say interesting because it's been kind of devastating if you're a farmer. You go back 12, 15 months ago, we were near historic lows on almost every single fertilizer product out there. And if I'd come on here and sat there and said, hey, by the time we get to October, 10th, 11th, here's where the prices are going to be, literally would never be asked to be on any sort of a program again. There was just no feasible way that happened. But here we are. And I mean, really, when you look back at the entirety of this year, it has just been black swan event after perfect series of events after yet another black swan events. Anything that could go wrong has gone wrong. So, and that's what it will really ultimately end up being. When we look back, when we teach future generations of ag about what happened during that 2021-22 cycle, it's going to be exactly that. Just everything that could have gone wrong did, and then some.
Well, we think about the general rise in potash, urea, you name it, and we look towards 22. A lot of guys trying to make their decisions for this 2022 planting season, not sure what direction they're going to go. They're watching the markets. We're watching to see where prices sit, and cost of inputs on the seed side and everything else rising as well. This is going to have a big impact here as we wrap up the harvest and producers start to decide what they're going to do for next year.
Yeah. That's a big conversation we've been having. You've always got to assume that the I states are going to grow corn. That's just what they do.
Mhm.
They have a big enough yield. They can sit there and say, yeah, this really stinks. Seed cost is up, chemical cost is up, fertilizer cost is up. I've seen some of the land prices recently it's been selling. That's crazy. That's a whole conversation itself. But then, and like we had said a little bit ago, I hate to ever call an acre a fringe acre, but it's those lower yielding acres that are out there that really determine the top end of what we're going to grow next year. And there's a lot of those guys that we've been talking to who are sitting there saying, at the current input cost for everything, and then looking at where like the December 22 corn price is, it doesn't work. Doesn't matter what I raise, it ends up with a red number at the end of it. I've got to look at doing something else. So now all of a sudden we got to start wondering, we're using 91 million acres for next year. Is that right? Is it going to be closer to 86, 87 million? Will we see if it does drop back because those acres do decide to go somewhere else? Now, do we see the corn price starting to rally? I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios that sit there and prove that we're far from done from this ridiculous volatility that we've seen.
Yeah, and we think about just the ridiculous volatility that is out there, and you mentioned some of those, quote unquote fringe acres and everything else. And we look at cotton, spring wheat, oats. I mean, the rise in so many different, uh, uh, the price for so many of these different crops really gonna just make some interesting decisions. And then you throw on top of it just supply chain issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, are we able to get fertilizer that we want to get? I'm hearing from a lot of retailers saying, "Hey, book your fertilizer now for next year, otherwise we might not get it."
Yeah. And that's a real concern. You look at something, the one that scares me the most out there is UAN, liquid fertilizer, nitrogen. And we came out of last spring very empty. The farm gate did a phenomenal job. They spoon fed that every single seed because that's what the corn price is telling us. That's what every price was telling us. Raise as much yield as possible. We will reward you for it. That meant we went into summer empty. Then you had Hurricane Ida. That, of course, we lost a lot of production there for 2-3 weeks there. We've had a lot of production downtime because COVID-19 delayed a lot of repairs, and those repairs have to be made. These nitrogen facilities, high stress, high temperature, high pressure type systems, they've got to be repaired on a regular basis. Europe, just not a single country or single location, Europe as a whole, production has gone down because natural gas prices have skyrocketed to 40. It's one thing after another. It all adds up to a very serious conversation that by the time we get to next spring, storage across the Midwest may not be filled up.
Now,
So
Josh, when you look at these markets, do you see us do you see this trend not, staying a trend? Do you see us coming back down, or do you see this, leveling off and we're going to be stuck with these higher prices for a while as you kind of analyze these markets and look at the situations that are out there in front of us?
for nitrogen, I unfortunately, and I hate saying this because it's not what people want to hear, but unfortunately, I think that we see these higher prices stick around for a while. You don't lose entire regions like Europe and not have prices stay up. You don't have, take China, for example. They are a major producer, and the government is taking steps now to try and reduce exports. That's going to leave the world short. So, unfortunately, I think the nitrogen side stays relatively firm. Phosphate and potash markets, I think that overall we see prices stay higher. But what happens this fall could be a big indicator. If we go into the fall and let's say demand isn't there because the farmers are saying, nope, I can't pay these kind of prices, or Mother Nature just doesn't allow the application. Well, now we go into the wintertime very full, and that changes the outlook of it a little bit. But ultimately speaking, I mean, everything looks like, I don't know they can continue the crazy price gains that we have seen. So I do think we start to see a little bit of a plateau, but unfortunately, I don't see a cliff coming on the other side. A lot of people are trying to draw similarities between 2008 and this year. And that's exactly what we ought to do. You look to history to make sure you don't repeat the sins of the past. But the problem is 2008 was a demand-driven bull market, which means if you don't have supply issues, when that demand goes away, it just plummets. This is a supply-led bull run. And that means if demand just all of a sudden goes away, suppliers just sit back and say, fine, I'll see you shortly. You just help me build up a little bit more. I know you need it. I'll be patient.
Do you have any tips for farmers as they're looking at the fertilizer market, trying to make decisions, trying to figure out what they can do, what they should use, et cetera, et cetera? Do you have any suggestions or advice for them as they're trying to make some of those decisions here this fall into next spring?
Yeah, and it's not really anything I can tell you as far as the markets go. It's more of just a general state of mind. The biggest one is don't let emotion cloud your judgment. And it's so easy to do. Listen, it's one of those things. It's very easy for me to sit here and say this. I'm not the one on the bank loan. I'm not the one having to make a decision. But every single farm out there is basically like a corporation, as big as a lot of them are, as many dollars flow through. A lot of the best CEOs don't let emotion cloud their judgment. So be riled up, be emotional. But when it comes to make that final decision, just look at the actual numbers. If you're going to reduce your phosphate potash, that may be the right answer. But if it's going to hurt your overall yield more than what you're saving on the phosphate potash, that may not be the best decision. Just make sure to think through it. And the other thing is have a conversation with your supplier. And I know you guys have been hammered in the past. You don't want to give information to anybody because that information is used against you. This is the year we want to have more discussions. And if that discussion is, hey, I'm going to put down phosphate potash this fall, I just don't want to pull the trigger yet, have that combo so they can prepare. Because trust me, as much as you don't want to pull the trigger, neither do they. They don't want to buy this high priced product and just hope that you're walking in the door. As bad as that is, if you wait until the absolute last minute and you show up on that retailer's doorstep and say, hey, I've changed my mind, I'm going to buy something, it may not be there. Have a conversation. Look at it, at least this year, view that relationship as a partnership. Talk to them about what you're going to do or what you're not going to do so they can at least have a fighting chance of preparing accordingly.
That is great advice. And I think with that, we will wrap it up. Josh, this is a situation we're going to be watching very closely in the weeks and months ahead. And I'm sure as things change, we'll get you back on to talk more about the current state of it. But Josh, I appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us here today on Market Talk.
Yes, sir. Have a good one.
That's Josh Linville with StoneX joining us here today on Market Talk. I'm Jesse Allen reporting.